This is Anders Kaur with the Journal of Political Risk. I have with me Douglas Laventour from Bloomberg News and Bob Whitcomb from the Pell Center for International Relations. We have a guest that will be possibly calling in, Jeremy Pan from Columbia University, in a few minutes. Bob, we were talking earlier about Lee Kuan Yew. He's passed. Rest in peace.
Yeah, a huge figure, a somewhat ambiguous guy. He helped turn Singapore into a gigantic financial center, gigantic international trade center. He certainly greatly improved the standard of living of his people. At the same time, he was authoritarian. And the negative side of his rule, in a way, was he gave some ideas to the current version of the Chinese empire, that you could, in the long run, have an authoritarian government with very limited political freedoms, and at the same time have prosperity. And certainly there's something to that, even though I think in the long run it's not a particularly good model. It's been very good for Singapore, yes, for the last few decades, but I think it's been referred to, if you will, over-referenced. It's much easier to do that kind of thing, of course, in a little city-state like Singapore. It's got several million people, but very manageable. And because Singapore is such an international center, he never, and because of his need to retain very close connections with the West, he did allow some freedoms. He and the ruling party, and they have something of a political opposition, much more than China proper. But I think the Chinese government has used that as sort of an excuse for excessive authoritarian government. That makes any sense. It's been always set up as a model. My whole working life, I was writing about Lee Kuan Yew in 1970, and he was always referred to even before the relative opening of China under Deng. But I think he's used too much as an example, given the peculiarities of Singapore.
I mean, what is the difference between a small city-state like Singapore and a massive state like China and the acceptability of an authoritarian regime?
Right. Go ahead, Doug. Did you have?
No, I was just meaning to the question.
No.
Go for it. Sorry.
Yeah. I think the thing about Singapore, it's not only a small city-state, but it's very much a crossroads. Has been for a long time, including under the English, the British, and so it's just sort of intrinsically more open than a giant continental empire like China. It's just referred to, it was used as a partial model when Deng Xiaoping opened up China in the 80s. And I think sometimes inaccurately referred to, because Lee Kuan Yew was never, of course, never ran the sort of dictatorship that's run out of Beijing, never to that extent. He certainly suppressed the press to some extent. Occasionally people were thrown in jail. But there wasn't anything as in the mainland China, and so I think the lesson of Singapore's success has perhaps been misinterpreted.
Well, actually, my team at Bloomberg Rankings, we have an excellent site, Bloomberg Best and Worst, if you Google it. By a whole range of metrics, even up into the most recent data available. To your point, it's kind of a big if, but by a large number of measures, Singapore has been doing quite well compared to the global economy. It's number one in the biggest change in employment, and actually I'll share the screen with you guys really quickly.
I mean, their GDP per capita is higher than the U.S. GDP per capita, which is pretty impressive for a little state.
Well, in a way, it's sort of a Switzerland kind of thing. It's a big banking center, too. It's sort of Switzerland with a lot of big container ships and obviously a lot of water. So it's, there we go. Very good.
Yeah, so they have the best change in employment from 2004 to 2014. That's just based on a percentage of the total workforce that's employed. These are all done by our data analysts at Bloomberg Rankings.
Great stuff, Doug.
And the most efficient healthcare in 2014, and also a proprietary metric that we came up with, and highlighting our side a little bit here. They were ranked 4th for the best for doing business on a whole host of metrics. The only countries ahead of it.
Can you expand that a little bit? We can't see that.
Sure, of course. 1 second, sorry. Let's see if I can zoom in on this. I'm not sure.
While Doug does that, I'll say
that the United States is ahead of them, though. That's a place to do business.
Exactly. Tell you what, Andrews, I'm gonna come off of this and put it in.
Oh, that's good. No, you got it. That's good. You had it. You had it good. Yeah. I mean, my one comment is that if you're a small state and you're an autocracy, you're not going to be that dangerous to the countries around you. If you're a massive state like China, right, that's a dictatorship, it's quite threatening to your people in your neighborhood. And so I think that's the big difference, where Lee Kuan Yew did have a similar approach in a way, although a bit more capitalist, I would say, than China, in terms of his authoritarianism, his crackdown on dissent internally. At least he wasn't a threat to his neighbors. He was friendly to the U.S., but China is a very different.
Well, it wasn't an empire. I mean, Singapore was sort of created by the British. It was sort of a spot of an island in a very important strait. So the whole sort of interconnection with the rest of the world is so different than China. Was this great giant blob taking up much of Asia, and they certainly don't have. Nobody's ever been worried about Singaporean aggression. So it's very different. But again, getting back to this thing, they constantly have read over the years of the people in the Chinese government referring favorably to Singapore, carefully kind of taking out some things they liked about it. That's sort of what's the euphemism? Directed democracy is one of the euphemisms for kind of a more benign dictatorship. It's also very nepotistic, sort of reminds me of, in that, his son is involved in the family, sort of like the Red Princelings in Beijing. But there are close connections with China at the same time. Because remember, Singapore is largely a overseas Chinese place, and so there are many similarities in Confucian and other aspects of Chinese culture, and including the importance of family connections and so on that apply in Singapore as they do in mainland China. When Singapore spun off from Malaysia, because ultimately the overseas Chinese didn't want to be run by the Malays, whom they look down on even now. There's a kind of racism.
I mean, the real comparison is between Singapore and North Korea. That's where you really see the difference that a leader will make. Right? Because North Korea actually had the opportunity to be something like a Singapore. There's no reason why it couldn't have been. Its landmass was actually greater. It had has more, it's in a great position to do well, but it just did horribly.
Well, I think in most of these countries where you have, I believe you call it, Bob, the directed democracy or something, you're also in largely culturally homogenous groups, I want to say, which is why this is just a personal belief, where you see situations like this work, quite frankly. And as to Andrew's point, in North Korea for the worse, but in Singapore for the better, where you can actually get your populace to rally around specific points without fear for retribution in many cases.
Well, I don't think they have the tradition of brutality. The Koreans have been a bunch of tough customers for a long time, and I think they were toughened further by the Japanese occupation, reinforced their nationalism, and it's a pretty rough-hewn place. A lot of country people, tough country peasant culture, while Singapore is relatively cosmopolitan. And Singapore, again, was not a country until just a few decades ago. Well, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, was something of a country.
All right, so while Jeremy's getting his image up, he does look like he's joined us, but we'll wait. We'll continue discussing until he gets his image up. Doug, you had a chart you wanted to show us.
A chart?
You were showing it to us, and then I said it was too small, and then you...
Oh, yes. This was going back to...
Still interested in that chart.
Yeah, 1 second. Sorry, we were having issues getting zoomed
The
in.
other thing we were talking about right before the show was the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is being proposed by Beijing as an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. Beijing sees these banks, these development banks, as a way to increase its influence globally. And they initially wanted a veto on what they were doing, but in order to get U.S. allies in Europe to join up, they have gone back on their veto plan, and they are now just saying. But if you read between the lines and you read the fine print, what we're seeing is they want 75% of voting shares for Asian countries,
Right.
and then they're going to divide the voting shares in proportion to the GDP of those countries, which means they're going to have more than a 50% vote, which means they're going to control the bank, right? So the recommendation from the U.S., of course, is to their allies, European allies, is, hey, let's not be chumps and buy into this. Don't put major quantities of financial resources into this bank, because the Chinese are just going to Shanghai, literally, those resources for their own influential purposes. So I think that's the, and maybe the Europeans, what I'm hoping is the Europeans want to put token amounts into this bank so that they can just be present at the meetings and keep an eye on what's going on.
Information collection point.
Yeah. I mean, that would be the only reason I could see. Yeah. Okay, so Doug, you have your chart up. Go ahead and explain.
Yeah. So if you guys can see this too, this is, and then we'll go back to the investment or infrastructure investment bank, because I think it's we had a couple interesting takes on it too. Again, this is a sort of proprietary product that my team at Bloomberg Best and Worst, now called Bloomberg Rankings, put together. It's called the Best for Doing Business, and we do this annually, and we consider such factors as the cost of setting up a business, the cost of labor's material, moving goods, basically a whole bunch of ease of business metrics. And actually, Hong Kong in 2013 was first. It still stayed first. Canada actually jumped 4 spots from sixth to second, and Singapore jumped 4 from 8th to 4th. It's an amalgamation of all of these scores. I think that Singapore has and continues to be very pro-business, as Bob mentioned, especially in financials, because it is a rather small city-state with not a whole lot of abundant natural resources. They're not going to be doing anything in mining per se. Yeah, but that being said, there's on one hand a significant ease of starting a business, but also a lot of personal restrictions that you have to keep in mind when actually living there.
Right. I mean, the personal restrictions are kind of humorous, right? They put you in jail for chewing gum, or lash you. I mean, that's not humorous when it happens to you, but it's bizarre. It's a bizarre throwback to the 17th century.
Well, if we could pivot once more to when you guys were talking about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think that Europeans' excitement about getting involved with this kind of directly points at the sort of unwillingness or inability for the IMF and the World Bank to directly inject capital and make their presence known. They're trapped quite a bit by bureaucracy. They tend not to act in a quicker and appropriate manner in certain circumstances. There are others that would argue with that, and I invite it. But at the same time, the World Bank has only gotten 2 major capital injections in the last 30 years. One was in 1988, and the most recent was either 6 or 8 years ago. So, if you want to get involved in an area like Asia, which is the only place right now that's significantly growing in a meaningful way, of course you're going to want to get into a place that is more targeted and honestly kind of shimmy and friend yourself up to China, whether you like it or not. There's really not a choice.
Also, China's got one hell of a lot of money. It's got a tremendous amount of foreign reserves. So, people are well aware of that. It's splashing money around. The last week we were talking about Africa. And so I think it's seen as sort of a bonanza, whether I don't believe it's a reliable partner, but I think people are eyeing piles of cash, and they know the Chinese are extremely enthusiastic enough about showing the flag. And that scares some people. Some people are attracted to it because I think the Chinese will give them, trillions to build stuff.
Well, the danger is that they use this as a conduit for their bribery and their corruption, and ways to reward their dictators who are supportive of them, or even politicians within democracies that are behind closed doors supportive of the Chinese and against the will of their people.
Well, sure, but it's not just for political power. It's for the enrichment of people in the Chinese regime, Chinese officials, and so on. I don't think we can underestimate the potential here for just old-fashioned economic corruption. This isn't just about the Chinese empire and getting more land indirectly or directly, but it's the potential for graft and skimming and so on.
Well, it kind of goes back to
everything that makes life worthwhile.
They use these payments, these development payments, right? And they've done this in the past to obtain, say, votes in the General Assembly. So they say to the Philippines or some other country, for example, if we give you this $500 million development investment, then you're going to turn around and you're going to support us in the vote that's very important to us, on Africa.
Well, of course, the United States has been known to do that too. Not to that extent, but we've done it too.
We do it for better purposes. I mean, our democracy and human rights and things like that. Ideally, we've made our mistakes too.
Support for business transactions. I mean, it's sort of interwoven in the great labyrinth of human intentions.
But it's going to be a lot worse if it's coming from dictators.
Right. Yeah, because there's no transparency.
To our point that we talked about last week with China and Africa. In many cases, the direct investment that's being made available through the African Investment Bank, I don't recall exactly the name of that, but the $2 billion of capital that they've infused there is making us and our direct investment look slightly inept. Actually, our Bloomberg News reporter, Charles Kenny, wrote an excellent, almost op-ed on this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. He quoted Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, pointed out in recent congressional testimony. It's a great quote. Quote, "It's not an accident that emerging economies are looking at other places because they are frustrated that, frankly, the United States has stalled a very mild and reasonable set of reforms in the IMF. And the failure to act," suggested Lew, "raised significant questions about U.S. credibility and leadership in the multilateral system."
Doug, what are the key reforms that the Obama administration is pushing? If Jack Lew is correct on this.
So there's been.
What are we doing? What is the America not doing what it should be doing?
Well, I'll throw out one thing. I mean, is that there's right now the U.S. has about 20% of the capital in the either the IMF or the World Bank. What is it, Doug? And they have a veto power. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, U.S. Allies have been complaining about this veto power that the U.S. has over many of the most important policy issues at the World Bank. And this has been used by China to convince other people to join their version of the World Bank, the AAIB, in order to strengthen their own position.
Even though the Chinese would have, in effect, veto power. So
right. So the Chinese will have effective veto power because they'll have most of the shares.
Right. Yeah, they'll have.
Yeah, and ultimately, what happened is the Obama administration has tried to pass through 4 times to get congressional approval for funding for the U.S. share of a finance. I think it was a finance and reform package. It shows the ineptitude of the U.S. Congress to do much of anything in this regards. And even back 6 years ago, the capital 5 years. I'm sorry, the capital increase only added about 30% of lending power, and you have to realize that was right at the height of the global financial crisis too. So that was eaten through almost immediately as both sovereigns and individual institutions went out for rescue.
Absolutely. I think there's sort of a Tea Party opposition to properly funding the IMF and the World Bank, too. I've got to say this. It's reminds me of Calvin Coolidge's line about reparations in the 1920s. You know, they hired the money, didn't they? And it's a sort of an attitude that the foreigners really don't deserve this money. That sounds really silly, but in fact it's true if you listen to the comments by some congressmen. I think the senators generally get it, but the U.S. House of Representatives is something.
Right. I mean, my argument there, Bob, would be that it is crucial that the Western world, both Europe, the United States, Japan, all of the most wealthy countries, really show some concern for developing countries.
Absolutely.
And pony up at least, you know, 1% or 2% of their GDP per capita to help democratic countries, and I'm not talking about autocracies, but democratic countries to develop, because that's a crucial issue.
It's the right thing to do, and it's enlightened self-interest.
It is the right thing to do. So I'm gonna turn to Jeremy Pham now, Professor Jeremy Pham from Columbia, who has come here to talk to us about Defense Department reform, both in strategy and planning. Jeremy, thanks for coming along, and please let us know, give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch of what you're proposing.
Glad to be with you, Anders. I hope the video and sound holds out, and if it doesn't, my apologies.
Very good.
I am speaking as someone who, as a member of civilian agencies, has interacted with the Defense Department in civilian military strategy exercises, and worked closely with the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, but not as an expert, an inside expert on DoD per se.
Right. I mean, maybe we should mention really quick, Professor Pham, that you've done work in the State Department, Defense Department. You've been for years working in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, you really have the credentials, especially on counterinsurgency, to discuss strategy and how to perfect strategy and planning.
Well, that's kind of you. I would never claim to know how to perfect it. I think strategy and planning in national security and international security, by definition, is going to be imperfect. But I have had, I think, my fair share of experience with the imperfections. I should say that I initially was a Treasury diplomat in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and more recently a State Department diplomat focusing on governance in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. And so my perspective, my firsthand perspective, is in part that of someone who was on the ground, really sort of working most at the kind of operational level rather than the truly strategic at Washington, although I have some Washington experience working on interagency strategic assessments as well. What I have found in both the Iraq and Afghanistan experiences is that the U.S. government, in all of its interagency glory, meaning the civilian agencies, the State Department, the Treasury Department, USAID, the Defense Department, and other agencies, is excellent at putting together comprehensive lists of aspirational objectives, but much less good, indeed quite poor, at prioritizing those lists and assessing the particular objectives for suitability, implementability and realism generally. And so in working both on Iraq strategy and Afghanistan strategy and the implementation of those strategies, what I found time and time again is that we had a list that was not prioritized, that included many unrealistic, unachievable objectives, certainly in the time frame contemplated, and often in any time frame, and that when people like myself tried to push back and narrow our objectives to a smaller number of the highest priority things that we had a chance of achieving during the time frames that were relevant, there was sort of reflexive pushback.
Right. Jeremy, let me ask you a quick question. Yeah. Taking one step back, from your experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, what do you think of the current strategy? Can you explain to us what is the current strategy and what you think about it? And then we're going to get more into detail in terms of your more global strategic suggestions.
Sure. Well, I am more closely connected to Afghanistan strategy than Iraq, because my time directly involved in Iraq was a number of years ago, and so and you know, entirely predates the current ISIS threat. So let me start with Afghanistan. What I understand the strategy to be is essentially an Afghanization of the requirement of the necessities of securing the country and running the country. There is, you know, at the height of the surge, there were some 140,000 NATO troops, 100,000, including 100,000 American troops. There were, I think, an unprecedented number of U.S. civilians and very large numbers of international civilians. And what all of these international resources were trying to do was supplement the Afghans' ability to secure the country and to run it, to perform the basic governance functions. That never worked particularly well. We were able to secure particular corners of it for particular time periods, but not comprehensively. The international forces, that was partly a function of the fact that even with large numbers of international forces with very advanced capabilities, it's a very big and a big country with very difficult terrain, lots of mountains and valleys, and it's partly a function of knowledge that the international forces could never fully understand the political dynamics in all the parts of the country. And the same thing goes for the civilian side. It's difficult for Americans to run our country. It's even harder for Americans or international forces to run someone else's country, which has a different history, different practices, etc. So the strategy, as I understand it, is the sort of second half of the surge, the sort of conclusion of the surge, which is to draw down international forces, having invested a substantial effort in trying to strengthen for a time Afghan capabilities and turn over to Afghans. The term of art used was transition. the primary responsibility for performing all of the security and civilian governance functions, and sort of leave it for Afghans to run it after an Afghan fashion.
Jeremy, can I ask a question? This is Bob Whitcomb, Robert Whitcomb. Why do we have so many projects? You know, like from what you're saying, I think that's true. We try to do too many things. Is this partly fiefdoms? Everybody wants a fork in the pie among all the various American agencies. Why are we, you know, all these, you know, 78 projects, something, rather than winnowing it down to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6? Why is that? Is that jurisdictional protectionism, or, you know, why are we doing it that way?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the answer that I'd give is that it's a result of multiple factors. One is you can think of as doctrinal. The major doctrinal innovation between the coalition intervention in Iraq and the NATO surge in Afghanistan was corresponded to the move from a primarily U.S. Doctrine of counterinsurgency, as Anders mentioned, to a NATO doctrine known as the comprehensive approach. Part of that was simply that NATO couldn't adopt wholesale exactly the same terminology that the U.S. military had formulated.
Because that was not politically viable, basically? Political, right. Small p.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you look at the counterinsurgency field manual that General Petraeus and others famously developed prior to the Iraq surge, you know, it's pretty comprehensive too. But the interesting thing to me was that when it became NATOized, if you will, and became known as the comprehensive approach, it wore on its sleeve its comprehensive aspirations. If the goal is framed as comprehensively transforming the institutions, all of the key institutions of a state.
A lot of civil society stuff, really a plethora of civil society projects. Sort of.
Yes, not only civil society, but you know, you just think of all of the institutions that characterize our world, all of our federal institutions, our state institutions, our city institutions, our county institutions. There is, you know, our social and political world is characterized by a great deal of complexity, and I think there's a fundamental mistake made. Maybe two fundamental mistakes. One is that the task in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan is to begin with a blank slate, that nothing that predated the intervention is usable. And then the second mistake is to think that the things that need to be constructed on that blank slate, if that's not mixing the metaphor, have to all be constructed at once. So you need, in Afghanistan, the one I think useful way of thinking about this is that it had traditionally 4 major levels of government. There was the central government, the 34 provincial governments, something like 400 districts, perhaps 40,000 villages. And then a variety of municipalities ranging from very small to very large, which existed somewhere between the district and the provincial level. So center, province, city, center, province, city, and or district, and village. And the surge era comprehensive approach to strengthening the Afghan state sought to strengthen all of those levels simultaneously. We had projects
not only strengthen, right, but create. because those things didn't exist before, right?
And simply,
Well,
that was beyond our reason.
As social entities, they existed. We didn't invent any villages that weren't there. But what didn't necessarily exist at all of those levels was formal governance institutions. There were traditional governance, there were informal governance institutions, but not necessarily a city hall and a mayor and a bunch of appointed officials.
So was there too much focus on trying to almost institutionalize the governing process on the American side?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no. Do you believe there's too much of a focus from the Americans and during the Reconstruction to almost institutionalize or make concrete these areas of government? Or should they have remained more nebulous?
More informal.
Yeah.
It's more informal, more traditional.
Yes, I think I like the informal or traditional contrast.
Personal relationships.
Better than institutional, but yes, I agree with the point.
Can you point to any places where that worked? I mean, some other examples, other countries, other eras where that approach worked. I mean, I would look at Japan and Germany as two successful transformations of dictatorial regimes. Japan was semi-dictatorial. I mean, Germany and Japan both had also some democratic history, even though they weren't democratic when we came in. But after World War II, they were run and ruled by military rule.
They're quite advanced societies, though. They're quite advanced economies. Obviously, the economies were shattered, but I mean, Germany had been a huge industrial power for a while, arguably the greatest industrial power, and a lot of Western connections. Japan had a lot of.
Can you adjust your camera?
Yeah, sure. Japan had a lot of second-hand Western traditions, but it certainly had, by world standards, a pretty advanced economy.
But at the same time, you still had a pretty. It was not semi-autonomous, but a very separate region in the Northern Islands and in the South and in Okinawa. You had culturally, homogenous but different groups of people that were still and still do in some ways, lead onto the shogunate era and all the different tribes, and it was very much an informal way of governing up through World War II when they united underneath a dictatorial rule. It actually seems, I think that's a cool analogy, Anders. It's strikingly similar.
So, Jeremy, how do you look at this issue then through your optic of simplifying strategy? Is that a fair understanding of your approach?
It is. Let me just say, if I could, one word about the Germany and Japan example, and then I'll come back to your question. I think Germany and Japan are, after World War II, are one of the sort of great mysteries, pose one of the great mysteries to the contemporary state strengthening, state building efforts. And I've come to the conclusion, without being an expert in either country, my guess is that there are two fundamental differences that distinguish those cases from the contemporary cases. The first is the one that Robert has already mentioned, which is that Germany and Japan had sophisticated political administrative structures prior to World War II, and those could be largely revived, and people, the citizens of those countries, were used to operating within that essentially modern administrative framework, and the devastation of the war was a temporary interregnum, but once the Reconstruction started, those structures and the habits of using those structures could spring back. And I think you have a different situation in most of the contemporary state-building interventions, if you will, where the countries, in some cases, had not yet achieved modern administrative a modern administrative state, or in any case, the state that they were used to was so foreign to Western sense is that we just didn't understand how it worked, and so what we tried to create or what we expected to see didn't correspond with what the people were used to. That's the first difference. The second difference, I think, is a matter of Western intervener respect, fundamental respect for the societies that we intervened in. In the case of Japan and Germany, these were formidable militaries that we had worked very hard to defeat militarily. They had, as already mentioned, formidable economies. We were able to see them as peers that might not do everything the way we did it, and where there were differences, maybe we were open to letting them do it in the traditional German or Japanese way. Whereas in the contemporary post-Cold War interventions, we've often done it in the rhetorical context of failed and failing states, and the premise of the interventions is precisely that these are non-functional societies and states, and consequently we should give no deference to any habits that came before, and essentially take it upon ourselves to build it from scratch. And I think that is essentially an unachievable objective.
Could I also slide in that the totality, the extent of the occupation of Japan and Germany by the Allies in the end of the war in terms of manpower and civil and military administration was much greater than anything that was ever done in Iraq and Afghanistan. We went into Germany in '45. I mean, this was industrial strength occupation across the country. Same thing with Japan when MacArthur was operating as viceroy. So there's a big difference in scale. I don't know if we could have ever done that in a place like Afghanistan, but we had hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany, and there were French troops and British troops, of course, the Russians in the east.
But those
has 30 million population, and you just mentioned there's 150,000 NATO troops at their height. Yeah. That's only one troop to every 200 population. So if you have a very resistant population with a country outside of it like Pakistan who's supporting the insurgents, right, which is what I believe was happening. I think that's all in the
absolutely, Anders, absolutely.
Then you're going to have a very hard time stopping that insurgency, which is essentially a business. It's almost a Pakistani business in Afghanistan to create an insurgency. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Jeremy, but
especially with 20,000.
I would go even further, though, Anders, and say that it's not simply a question of troop to population ratio. And note, with respect to Robert's example of the scale of the industrial strength scale of the post-World War II occupations, I think it's fair to say, I don't think anyone would disagree that most of those drafted soldiers serving time in Germany or Japan were not experts on experts on neither German or Japanese culture or on civil administration of any sort. At best there were a handful of people who understood one or the other, and probably a very small handful indeed who understood both. Mm-hmm. The key, I think, was, this goes back to my point about the sort of fundamental respect for the society, was a kind of Wizard of Oz effect where we sort of hid in plain sight behind the curtain and let the Japanese and the Germans revive their own state. Whereas we were unwilling to do that in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan until, at least until the very end, when the sort of the fact of our inability became so undeniable that that we couldn't deny it, and we had to begin drawing down.
Partly because we didn't really consider
them real countries. Which is that in Germany and Japan, you didn't have an outside supporter of any insurgents inside the country. Whereas in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, in Iraq, Iran was supporting the insurgents. In Afghanistan, Pakistan was supporting the insurgents. And in Vietnam, China and Russia were supporting the insurgents. And so I think that outside supporter issue is key. I just don't see how that's not.
It's a big factor. I think it's a big factor in some of the troubles, some of the difficulties. But remember that even in pre-surge 2006, 2007 era Iraq, the Iran-supported Shia militias were only half of our problem. The other half were Sunnis, were Iraqi Sunnis. And fast forward to the present, where the challenge is ISIS, which has some external support, some regional, foreign fighters, and it has certainly some cross-border Syria, a lot of cross-border Syria-Iraq effect. But it is also part of the success is that it's drawing on the disaffection of Iraqi Sunnis, and that disaffection is certainly provides an audience that to make use of external support. But they would be unhappy whether there was external support or not.
Yeah, Shiite-dominated, Shiite-run government in Baghdad, so that makes them mad, right. Obviously.
Right.
Now, I'll throw up another historical example, which is Malaysia. Malaysia is highly, Malaysia was an example of an insurgency in the 50s that actually the counterinsurgency succeeded. It's one of those examples.
Great
I don't know how that fits into Dr. Pan, your simple strategy approach.
Okay, well, I'm gonna sort of dodge half of that question and refer the Malaya example specifically just to my friend John Nagel's book, Eating Soup with a Knife, which took that as its central illustration, and John then went on to be one of the drafters of the counterinsurgency field manual. But let me answer your question about what I think might be at least some components of an alternative approach. Earlier, I was making my argument that it is the comprehensiveness of the objectives and the aspiration that is a large part of the source of the lack of realism and unachievability of these contemporary intervention strategies. And the sort of the alternative to a comprehensive building from scratch on the assumption of a blank slate is a more organic social and political development, which I think is consistent with our own history, which is you start with a few simple structures, and over time you get better at those structures and you make them more complex, and those complexities begin interacting with each other and in ways that are and are not foreseen, and after a generation or a couple of generations or 100 years or a couple of 100 years, you have the complex and, dare I say, comprehensive political institutions of a contemporary society. The crucial thing about that
English common law, and Enlightenment ideas of federalism. You mean like in America? Yeah.
English. The development of the English common law is absolutely a model of this kind of organic, gradual, incrementalist growth. And the crucial thing about it is that although it is possible at periodic junctures perhaps to codify the common law as it's developed to a point, or to record all of the cases that represent the common law itself was not created by a single drafter writing all of the laws. At some point in time,
it's accumulative, sort of. Yeah.
organically.
I'll throw out that this reminds me of a strategy, a military strategy in Afghanistan that's published it's called the ink spot or ink blot strategy, and it's you take when you achieve your goals in a particular small district in Afghanistan, and those would be military goals plus developmental goals. You maximize your development funds into those areas, you secure those areas, and hopefully over time that ink spot will grow. And I think what you're talking about, I'd almost call it a bureaucratic ink spot strategy, or where you're growing a bureaucracy or a governance structure, a rule of law structure from things that existed prior, such as the tribal law, other laws. And interestingly, the Taliban did use tribal law. They did use the kinds of laws, the mullahs that were inside the villages and had their own legal system. They piggybacked on that quite successfully, I think. What do you say, Pam?
I think it's an interesting analogy, but I'm not sure. I'm not. I have enough reservations about the military interpretation of the ink spot strategy to have doubts about sort of using that analogy. Let me talk about the military application first, and then give you a couple of examples that I think are along the lines of what you're suggesting. The problem with the military version of the ink spot or ink blot strategy is that it relies on a literal geographical metaphor, right? So you pick a spot on a map and you put a bunch of resources into that, and you hope that with the goal of establishing stability and perhaps some degree of governance, and you hope that stability and governance spreads geographically to other parts of the map. It's possible that works as a purely security strategy, as a strategy for strengthening and developing civilian institutions. I think that geographical perspective doesn't work at all. And I'll give you an example of how it didn't work in Afghanistan, and then I'll give you a counterexample of what I think would have been a better approach. The way it didn't work in Afghanistan is that we would, following the military, and this is not a coincidence, following the military, the civilian efforts to strengthen governance would be concentrated in a particular geographical area, often a key district, and General McChrystal famously said at the beginning of the Marja operation in Helmand Province, which took place in not just a district of Helmand Province, which is the next administrative level down, but a section of a district called Marja. General McChrystal said, "We're going to bring in government in a box." But you don't bring in, government doesn't exist in a box. Government is a set of interconnections, particularly between different levels of government. And in Afghanistan, if the goal was, which is a very legitimate goal, of seeking to extend governance beyond the capital in Kabul, the first administrative level down, below the center, were provinces. And it was the provincial level was also the level that had the second greatest amount of resources, of human capital, of filled positions with educated people, or with officials with a sufficient level of education. The further down you go, the more limited you get in terms of human capital, and obviously the further away from the center you get. And so in our attempt, in the civilians' attempt to implement a civilian equivalent to the military ink blot strategy, we would focus on isolated districts and give certainly insufficient, in many cases virtually no attention to how that district connected to its superior province and how that province connected to the center, how resources and policies and input could flow back and forth.
And the ink blot, sort of the ink blot, the ink patch approach, it doesn't do much about building national institutions.
And especially in a country that is as rurally based as Afghanistan, you can draw the comparison to Western Iraq, where some argue it worked, some argue it didn't. But in Afghanistan, if you're trying to do an ink blot and there's nothing connecting except really tiny tendrils between very, very small villages, to your point, it does not work as well, especially if you don't have the links in place to the district government that might, quite frankly, not be serving the best interest of some of these villages.
Now, I might agree with you guys, but I will put the other side, which is that in an ink blot strategy, as opposed, I mean, the alternative to the ink blot strategy in Afghanistan was the global Afghanistan strategy, where you dilute your forces so much as to thinly cover the whole country. Now, with the ink blot strategy, the idea was to fix one spot. Now, Marja was one of the worst spots in the whole country as far as insurgency, but fix one spot. And once you get that spot, you use it as an example for the rest of the country to incentivize other regions.
Yeah, we tried that in Vietnam.
To fight against the insurgents. So I see your point, though, where a geographic ink spot approach may be a lot worse than I would say a nation building or bureaucratic ink spot strategy, where you're focusing on building institutions. And from existing institutions, building those good institutions. Of course, we're also trying that in Syria right now. We're trying to help the good insurgents versus the bad insurgents in Syria. It's unclear exactly how all that works.
Anders, let me just briefly sketch out an example of an alternative strategy, which I think has actually sort of belatedly been embraced by at least some key Afghan and international actors in Afghanistan, which I think illustrates the general point of a more it's not just the simplicity of the strategy; it's the non-comprehensiveness of the strategy. And I'll just focus on two elements of it. The first is as an alternative to the narrow geographical focus, where you focus on a handful of districts with the hope of having an illustrative effect. If we had instead focused on strengthening the next strongest level of administrative competence after the center in Kabul, and this was, of course, after investing many years in building up institutions at the center in Kabul. But if after, say, from 2006 forward, we had focused on the next level of the second greatest level of administrative competence, that would have meant strengthening the provinces. And if rather than focusing on, just to pick a number out of the air, 34 demonstration districts scattered throughout the country, we had focused on the 34 provinces, we would have had the whole country covered. We would have had some degree of coverage, some degree of incremental improvement that concerned the whole country, rather than isolated districts unconnected to a larger approach. So that's sort of his.
Can I point out one thing, which is my sense was that to some extent we were doing that because the province level governments were relatively well funded compared to the district level governments. Once you get down to the district level governments in Afghanistan, you really had these teeny little HESCO barrier. You had a few buildings with HESCO barriers around them and not much else. I mean, there wasn't much development funding down at that level. There wasn't much infrastructure. You could barely get the governor himself to actually show up at the district, the district governor show up at the district, building. and it was so undercapitalized. You know, we just didn't have enough money. I mean, part of the problem, in the way I see it, is that we're really talking about drops in the bucket. I mean, we had the amount of resources that we had to address all these issues was just minuscule compared to the need.
Well, I think without sidetracking the discussion, I would say that the appearance of greater funding of the provincial governments and the provincial capitals was illusory because, of course, the primary source of that funding at the provincial level was provincial reconstruction teams, i.e. international funding. It was not the Afghan budget. A PRT spending a lot of money in province X or Y did nothing to strengthen the linkages between the center and the province and the ability of the province to state its prioritized requirements to the center and then receive some degree of funding, even if the center was ultimately primarily funded by the internationals.
Well, it's part of the problem.
I think talking about the...
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to chime in.
Yeah.
Was part of the problem that so much of the money was being stolen? I mean, if we had had better controls over the thievery going on, I mean, how much of this money actually ended up in its intended spot?
I think fix your camera, Bob.
Yeah.
I think it's a chicken or egg issue, Bob. As I understand it, the majority of money, the largest source of international funds generally were funds that were spent through things like the PRTs, and that did not go through a central budget system, which we and the Afghans invested a lot of money in trying to strengthen the controls over, so that the leakage, as it were, could be minimized. Yeah. And so, yes, a lot of money was stolen at the provincial level, but if we had invested, put more of our money through the public financial management system rather than off budget, perhaps there would have been less money stolen.
It was worth it.
But I just want to get in the other.
Even if it were stolen. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I want to just mention the other component of my sort of alternative strategy, not so much because we're trying to second guess Afghanistan strategy at this late date, but because I hope that what we've learned in Afghanistan and Iraq could help inform more effective international approaches in other countries should we find ourselves in this situation. And so Anders asked me earlier what a non-comprehensive strategy might look like. And my favorite example of what a non-comprehensive strategy might look like that doesn't seek to fix or strengthen or establish all institutional systems simultaneously, but just focuses on a few key prioritized ones to start with, in the hope that you can then build on that in the future, is precisely to start with the local system for prioritizing the use of finite resources and then executing those decisions. Another name for which is the budget process. All governments understand that you have to follow the money, that the most important statement of a state's priorities, the most important statement is what a governing entity chooses to spend money on and how much. And if something is unfunded, that's a pretty good sign that it's not a priority. In my experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of work was done, a lot of progress was made in improving their budget systems, but even before the intervention, there was some kind of system to prioritize the finite resources that these governments had access to. And I think that that is a prime example of a system and an institution, a public administration institution, that is so fundamental and that affects everything else, that you can safely focus a lot of attention on seeking to strengthen that first, And once you have that system, you have a decent process by which the competing priorities of different ministries and different regions are reconciled in the form of a budget which has resources put against it, and then that those priority decisions, which are documented in a budget, are then implemented. That sort of enables all other civilian functions. If I were in charge, I would say the first two things that a post-intervention state strengthening effort should focus on would be strengthening the security forces and strengthening the budget process.
That makes a lot of sense. The PR guy in me wants to call it a targeted strategy rather than a non-comprehensive strategy. I don't know what you think about
That's fine.
that friendly amendment.
One of my favorite words was focused.
Focused strategy. I like that. Pinpoint, focused strategy. Yeah, I like all of those. All right, you were going to say something, Bob?
I think yes. Was I? I can't even remember now.
All right.
Yes.
Well, maybe
I would say maybe just something. When we're talking about priorities, and we're talking about not just about military or local security issues, obviously there are things like public health, local education, physical infrastructure, this kind of thing. Has there been a system in effect which has set priorities in that way? You know, does public health come first? Does infrastructure come first, Jeremy? In your experience, I can think of 4 or 5 main areas of governance. Those would probably be among them.
In my experience, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were 2 answers to that question. With respect to money that was spent by individual foreign countries off budget, there was absolutely no way to coordinate and set a universal set of priorities.
Yeah.
Because Japan had its priorities for spending its money, appropriated by its legislature, and the U.S. had our priorities, and every country.
There you go. That's a great answer. It's really very little coordination amongst the international donors, if you will, participants.
But by contrast, if you put it into the Afghan budget, and it doesn't have to go directly into the Afghan budget, the most effective mechanism for putting it into the Afghan budget with some pretty rigorous controls was a multi-donor trust fund administered by the World Bank called the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. We put it into the Afghan budget, then the budget process itself requires a prioritization in which certain things fall out and certain things come to the fore.
Sure.
Let me ask you.
Forgive me if I'm being.
Oh, go ahead, Doug.
No, I was gonna say, forgive me if I'm being like completely oversimplistic here, but isn't there something to be said just like before you even get into the budgeting process about the constant reality and fear of attacks that derail any sort of rebuilding? I mean, one of the first Bloomberg articles that I read was back in like 2005 or 2006. I think it was called Guerrilla War 101, and it was something along the lines of like, we need closure, the Afghan government needs closure, but you have a whole host of people that are going to work against you and fight until doomsday, whatever their doomsday might be. Isn't that, I mean, before you even focus on budget, is, again, possible oversimplicity, but don't you have to...
Why build the bridge? They're going to blow it up next week.
Right.
Yeah, you need a baseline of security, and in order to accomplish anything, and particularly in order to extend governance, if you're talking about extending it from Kabul to the provinces, for instance, that increases the space in which there needs to be security. So I'll give you a classic example of this. In 2006, in Iraq, which was the height of the violence essentially the civil war, the sectarian civil war. Civil servants were too afraid to go to work because they might be killed on the roads. The ministries might be blown up. It was very difficult to travel or communicate back and forth between Baghdad and the provinces, and so that even in that context, some governance got done, but it was like a tremendous sort of wet blanket over everything. And what brought this home to me was shortly after I returned from from Iraq in 2007. Washington had a giant snowstorm, at least by Washington standards. It was called, you may remember it was called the Snowpocalypse. And the Office of Personnel Management, let federal workers, declared that federal workers shouldn't come in for like a week. And even in Washington, D.C., in the heart of the U.S., even in the internet, email, remote commuter world, the fact that there was a physical impediment on the streets that prevented the normal patterns of communication meant that governance slowed down, and it had a measurable effect on growth.
Sure. Like
because
Boston
not only,
in the last couple of months, Boston's been paralyzed for.
Bob,
That's right.
We're not going to get you started on snow right now. We know you're very upset about it. But I do have a question for Jeremy, which is had more of the money gone through the normal Afghan or Iraqi budget process, how would it have been used differently?
That's a great question. I think, so let's just, for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that the process by which the money would have gone through the budget, and the two countries are different in this case because Iraq, by the time the security had improved enough for their administrative systems to start functioning in a quasi-normal fashion, the price of oil had increased substantially, and Iraq had, frankly, more money than it could spend. Whereas in Afghanistan, it was always a fundamental problem that they were one of the poorest countries in the world, and so they were always reliant on international funding. I think it's a great counterfactual question, and for that reason, I'm not sure that I can give you a detailed answer. I can give you a sort of general answer, which is that we would have spent much less of it on U.S. contractors, prime contractors that the U.S. Congress had confidence in whom the U.S. Congress had confidence in their accounting procedures. What the U.S. Congress is afraid of is throwing money down the metaphorical sinkhole, and the response to that is a strong preference for essentially for what are called parallel structures, spending through parallel institutions, which amount to a U.S. contractor that knows how to provide paperwork understandable to American accountants, which then does none of the work, takes a lot of the profit, and subcontracts it down, perhaps 5 levels, perhaps 10 levels before they get to an Afghan or Iraqi or some other company from the region that is willing to work in that environment. I think there would have been much less of that subcontracting, of that contracting and subcontracting, less of the legal or illegal skim that comes with each layer, and you probably would have gotten more bang for the buck.
You've just done it with direct government funding. Make it much more direct.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, with appropriate controls in place, and the most effective way to do that is often through multilateral institutions like the World Bank, which are used to this, which do this every day. Sometimes that means that the spending is slower than the U.S. would like, because they don't want to disperse into a black hole, into a project where they have no visibility into what's going on. And if the U.S. is in a giant rush because we only have our 100,000 troops in country for 18 months, and we have leaned on Congress to double the civilian assistance budget during that same 18 months, then you're not going to be able to push all of that money through the carefully designed systems.
Now, Jeremy, do you think that some of that bias then towards U.S. contractors or other national donor country contractors would be because maybe those contractors had some sort of political influence on Congress to spend their money that way?
That's a possibility.
I think it's a possibility too. I think to your point, I mean, aside from political influence, it had to have been the fact that that we needed, or the political leadership at the time needed something pushed through very, very quickly, and the most effective way to do that, at least the thought was, to contract directly through U.S. corporations that had the capabilities for quick deployment. And possibly, I mean, feel free to disagree with me, but they might have been willing to eat some skimming or some loss, obviously not recognizing the scale at which it would have occurred.
Well, I agree with that in general. I mean, but what I would say is in a conflict situation like this, and we call them post-conflict, but of course in both Iraq and Afghanistan there was a lot of hot fighting going on simultaneously. The accountability for producing results only comes a number of years after the fact, and so what you have is an appropriating body like the U.S. Congress that says, we want to support our troops, and we want to support this national security priority. And our generals and our civilian leaders tell us that what we need to do in order to do that is throw money at the problem. And then they go to a U.S. contractor, a beltway bandit, if you will, and say, if we double your budget or quadruple your budget, can you handle it? The contractor is always going to say yes.
They're going to say yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But they, even though they are in very few cases going to be directly responsible for implementing that project on the ground in this area of hot fighting. They know they're going to subcontract it. They know that the thing may or may not get built. And what the clear pattern that you have in both Iraq and Afghanistan is that when the inspector generals get around to taking a close look at the effectiveness of the spending and what was actually produced as a result of these tsunamis of money thrown at first Iraq and then Afghanistan, what they consistently find is that a tremendous proportion of the money was the money that wasn't wasted was spent disproportionately on security. Sometimes 40% of the total is spent on security, and then what isn't stolen is often spent on building things that are substandard or inappropriate to the country, or can't be maintained by the country, or use a fuel that's not available in the country. You just have to take the briefest look at the website of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction or the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction to see abundant evidence of this pattern. Bad spending followed only a number of years later by scathing audits, and in some cases, in a few cases, penalties.
Now, I agree with everything you said. From our American perspective, it's a tsunami of funding, right? We're putting trillions of dollars into Iraq and Afghanistan, if you include veterans benefits. But from an Afghan perspective, they just don't see very much of that on the ground. It's in a way what I would describe it as tokenism from an Afghan perspective, right? So I think it's to some extent it's a bit of a PR stunt. Some of these development projects that we've done, or Afghan training programs, we put in soldiers to train a few guys in how to use a rifle, and it's just not. It doesn't end up being very much on the ground.
Yeah, I think you're right, but part of that, Anders, is because development is a multi-generational task. It doesn't matter how much you increase the scale in a short term. There are hard limits which can be expanded, but expanded incrementally and slowly. There are hard limits as to how a country can usefully use amounts of resources. And so I agree with you, but if the except if the implication is that if we had budgeted, if the U.S. or the international community had budgeted 5 times the amount that we actually spent, or 10 times the amount we actually spent, that we would have gotten different results. I think what we saw was what happens when we exceed the absorptive capacity, even using a lot of workarounds like parallel institutions. You just stop getting results, and you get just larger amounts of corruption.
Well, I mean, would that be 5 or 10 drops in the bucket as opposed to 1 drop in the bucket? I mean, I don't. That's just how it. I mean, we improved some roads. We put water pumps in a bunch of villages. We built some dams to produce electricity. But still, even if you're in one of the big cities in Afghanistan, you know, your lights go out at 9 p.m. and you can never really turn on your air conditioner if you even had one, which you don't.
Before the intervention, Afghanistan was, you know, one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. All of the other countries in the world were working as hard as they could to maintain and increase their level of development and their rate of growth and their ranking on those scales. I can't even imagine the scale of resources that would have been necessary to vault Afghanistan from, you know, 180 to 120, or some number that where you would have noticed an appreciable difference.
Is it still one of the 5 poorest countries? Well,
I think so. Yes.
Well, actually, now it's down to about 20th. But still, a lot of that increase for 2013. But a lot of that increase is just from the war economy, right? Yeah, that war economy is not touching your average Afghan in a village somewhere.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we should probably wrap up now. Professor Pam, I just want to give you a last chance to hit any points that you wanted to hit that you didn't have a chance to hit.
No, I think we've covered it all. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. This is Anders Corr with the Journal of Political Risk. We've had with us Professor Jeremy Pan from Columbia University, who's really been great. Doug Laventer from Bloomberg. He's a data reporter, data journalist from Bloomberg. And then we have Bob Whitcomb, who is editor of the New England Diary and a fellow at the Pell Center on International Relations. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And Professor Pam, we'll have to bring you back for a focused discussion on ISIS sometime, because I think you might have some very interesting things to say about that. Thank you very much, and goodbye.